Welcome. I'm David Skeel, Chairman of the Oversight Board, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us today for this public meeting of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, which is once again being held by video conference. As always, I'd like to ask everyone who's on this video stream to cooperate in having as productive a meeting as possible. And the starting point for that is to make sure if you're not talking that you are on mute throughout the video conference. To start the meeting, I'd like to take a roll call of the members of the board, starting with Andrew Biggs.
Present.
Ana Mata Santos.
Present.
Justin Peterson.
I'm here.
Omar Marrero, the ex officio representative from the governor.
Present, Chairman. Good morning.
And I am here as well. Quorum requires a majority of the voting members of the board. We do indeed have a quorum, and so the meeting can now be called to order. As usual, I'd like to ask Jaime El Khoury if you will be, Jaime El Khoury, the general counsel for the board, if you would be willing to be secretary for the meeting.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. El Khoury. Thanks to all of you in attendance at this public meeting. As I just mentioned, it's being held by video conference, so thanks for joining the live stream, and thanks for folks who will be watching this after the meeting is over as well. As usual, I'm pleased to say that we will have a simultaneous webcast of the meeting in Spanish, and it will also be translated in sign language as well. If you log in to our website in English, you'll get the English audio. If you log in to our website in Spanish, you'll get the simultaneous translation in Spanish. Again, as usual, the board will be handling public questions and comments through a form that is on the Oversight Board website. So if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, click on the webcast page, fill out the form, including your name and any questions or comments, and the board will later answer these questions, as many as we can get to, at the assigned point towards the end of the meeting. Public will have, from the time that the meeting starts right now until up to 15 minutes before the public comments period actually starts during the meeting, to share any questions or comments on the form. As always, any questions that we're not able to get to during the meeting we will answer in writing, and we'll post the answers on our website. I'd like to thank all of the non-board members, both staff of the Oversight Board and others who will be joining us today. And as I said, I look forward to a productive meeting. Just to give you a sense of what we have on our agenda today, we once again have a fairly lengthy agenda. We'll start with approval of minutes from the last public meeting. We will then have an update from the executive director. The third item will be a Section 204 reapportionments and reprogramming discussion and motion. Fourth item will be contract review under Section 204B of PROMESA. Fifth item will be a refunding proposal and discussion under Section 207 of PROMESA. The sixth item will be a particular municipal debt item, also under Section 207 of PROMESA. We will then discuss laws 80, 81, or Acts 80, 81, and 82. Eighth item will be a discussion of the Commonwealth Plan of Adjustments. And then the 9th and 10th items will be the public comment period and any other matters that come before the board. So again, a relatively robust agenda that hopefully we can proceed through efficiently. The first thing that we need to do is to approve the minutes from the board's last board meeting, which was held on October 30, 2020. The proposed minutes are included in the meeting materials, and they're attached as an exhibit to or as an appendix to the meeting materials. Let's start off with any questions or comments on the minutes. Are there any questions or comments about the minutes from the last public meeting? Okay, hearing no questions or comments, would a board member be willing to move to approve the minutes?
I move to.
I second.
All right, so we've got a movement in a second, and Andrew, can you read the resolution that we're?
I move to approve the minutes of the board's public meeting held on October 30, 2020, as presented in Appendix A in the form presented to the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs, and Mr. Peterson seconded. Can I have a voice vote? All in favor say yes.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the motion passes unanimously, and the minutes are approved. The next item that we have is an update from Executive Director Natalie Jaresko. And so I will turn it over to Ms. Jaresko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all. During the last board meeting, I focused on the steps Congress laid out in Promesa for the board to be able to complete its work and go away. That included access to capital markets and 4 years of balanced budgets on a modified accrual basis. Today, having recently passed the 4th anniversary since the board's first meeting in Fajardo, I'd like to reflect on the accomplishments the board has achieved on behalf of the residents of Puerto Rico. If you turn to the next page. It's important to understand the environment that existed when the board was conceived. At the time, Puerto Rico had amassed an unsustainable debt of more than $70 billion and more than $50 billion in unfunded pension liabilities, triple the level from the decade before. The economy was in structural decline, and more than 10% of the population had already left the island in search of greater economic opportunities. Despite those challenges, government spending remained bloated, lacked transparency, and the provision of services to the people was inefficient. Importantly, all the overspending drew down the government's bank balances, leading to a dangerously low liquidity level and revenue shortfalls that impaired strategic decision-making. In fact, at one point, the government's TSA or Treasury bank balance fell to as little as $15 million. I mention all that because the government situation was unstable and highly tenuous when the Oversight Board was established and the automatic stay on debt service was enacted. There were many factors that brought this to occur, but critically, there was a lack of fiscal accountability. If you turn to the next page. And as you know, the Oversight Board is guided by key provisions in the law. The key provisions that I want to make sure everyone is aware of includes one, which is Promesa 405M4, which says that it requires the board to take a comprehensive approach to the fiscal management and structural problems and adjustments on the island. No part of the government is exempted. Turn to the next page. And while more work remains, there are 4 main categories of progress I would like to highlight for you today. First, our significant progress on achieving consensual debt restructurings. Second, fiscal accountability. Third, financial transparency. And lastly, economic development. You turn to the next page. Part of the board's role is to facilitate and negotiate consensual restructurings with creditors, many of whom have invested in Puerto Rico for a very long time. Importantly, however, those negotiations must be done in the context of the guardrails laid out by Promesa. Towards that end, one of the most important provisions of the law is Section 201, which requires any certified fiscal plan to provide a method to achieve fiscal responsibility and access to capital markets. Section 201 also lays out a careful balance of 14 criteria that must be followed for the board to be able to certify the plan and have confidence it meets both the fiscal responsibility and capital market tests. In addition to respecting the relative lawful priorities or lawful liens, Some of those other criteria under the law require the fiscal plan to 1, ensure the funding of essential public services, 2, provide adequate funding for public pension systems, 3, provide for the elimination of structural deficits, enabling the achievement of fiscal targets, and 4, provide for capital expenditures and investments necessary to promote economic growth. So now I want to turn and just review some of the accomplishments under each of these 4 categories. If you'll turn to the next page. First, the board, working closely with the government, has achieved considerable success and progress on achieving consensual debt restructuring agreements that benefit the people of Puerto Rico. In aggregate, we have facilitated the successful consensual restructuring of more than 30% of Puerto Rico's debt and have already filed proposed agreements for another 55% of the debt. Here are just a few of the highlights. First, with COFINA, the restructuring resulted in the reduction of total debt service by more than $17 billion. That is $17 billion of debt service savings as a result of the restructuring. It also freed up 46% of the sales tax revenue collected for the general fund. This was a critically important milestone that shows consensual restructurings can occur. Second, we've restructured the GDB debts, reducing the principal outstanding by 45%. And just as importantly, we structured the new debt such that it is non-recourse to the Commonwealth. Third, we've completed the reprofiling of federal government debt at PRASA. And by significantly reducing the interest costs, PRASA was able to save nearly $380 million over the first 10 years. It also enabled PRASA to unlock an incremental $400 million in new federal funding from the EPA and USDA, all of which, those savings and that incremental funding, can now be invested back into the water system, which is in desperate need of improvement. Finally, the board has entered into restructuring agreements on another $9 billion of debt at PREPA and $35 billion of collective claims at the central government. As part of those restructurings, important agreements have already been reached with the official retiree committee and certain labor unions. Both agreements have substantial consensual agreement of stakeholders. Next page. The government and the oversight board have shown the willingness and the ability to reach consensual deals, having restructured over $23 billion of existing debt through the various mechanisms available under PROMESA, resulting in total on that $23 billion of debt in a 30% reduction in the debt. Here you can see more clearly the value that was created for the benefit of the people of Puerto Rico. And while there's no question that more work is needed, these principal and total debt service reductions have started to set the government on a path toward financial stability. While negotiations are continuing, considerable progress has been made in the proposed RSAs and plans of adjustments for other pending debt restructurings. When looking at the 2 pending restructurings for PREPA and the central government debts, there are also a key few points that I'd like to mention. With regard to the PREPA RSA on file, since the charges are fixed, the cash flow to the bondholders will rise or fall based on actual electricity demand. To the extent that electricity load underperforms projections, the RSA savings will be greater given reduced cash flow to the RSA bondholders. In fact, a portion of the debt may receive full payment or no payment, depending on the future load. As it relates to the Commonwealth, we're going to discuss that proposal later today, so I won't continue on it now. With regard to financial transparency and accountability, these are 2 elements that are required to balance the budget and stop the historic pattern of overestimating revenue. Financial transparency and accountability are 2 areas where considerable progress has been made by the government with the Oversight Board's steadfast efforts. On the financial transparency front, there are now 19 multi-year detailed fiscal plans that include reforms to government operations and create the framework for debt negotiations, providing a strategic plan for operations and economic development and development of those relevant entities. The government is also producing and publishing now more than 30 reports on cash, budget, tax expenditures, and pay-go costs, among others. Spending is prioritized, and the budget resolutions are now much more transparent, detailed to enable the legislature and the public to see how taxpayer dollars are being spent. And the same transparency has extended to liquidity. Because of the board's efforts and the work with the government, the government has compiled and is tracking more than 2,700 bank accounts. I remind everyone that 4 years ago, we had no idea what bank accounts existed, where they were, or what the balances were. This identification and this transparency in bank accounts has been incredibly helpful in identifying the $6 billion in cash consideration that's being offered to Commonwealth creditors in the latest proposal. On the fiscal accountability side, the board is holding the government accountable for the implementation of more than 120 reform implementation plans. It's monitoring quarterly budget to actuals and has placed strict controls on spending and reapportionments. Unlike the past, when the government used prior year appropriations to fund current expenses, often when the cash was already gone, the board has positioned the government to start living within its means, including having an emergency reserve to be available at the most difficult times. Similar accountability extends to the contract review and procurement policies, both of which have been reformed to increase transparency under the board's watch. We had a press conference this week on the successful promulgation of the GSA or ASAHE new procurement regulations. But this also extends to tax expenditures, with the government publishing its first comprehensive tax expenditure report, showing for the first time the level of revenues lost and the awards to various industries on the island. That 302 reported tax expenditures that cost the government more than $21 billion in lost revenue in 2017, a level that is on average 2 times the total tax receipts relative to other states. None of these things that we've just gone through existed prior to the 4 years of the work of this board together with the government of Puerto Rico. It is the collaboration with the government over the 4 years and the successful implementation of these that leads us to have this transparency and accountability. Next slide. In fact, this transparency and accountability are critical to avoid the mistakes of the past that landed Puerto Rico in bankruptcy, emptied the coffers of the pension funds, and led to the adoption of PROMESA. Key elements of past financial practices that the board has put an end to with the government's cooperation include: 1, over forecasting of revenues. Here, what you see on the screen is visually how the government's history of over forecasting revenues relative to actuals led to overspending. And what you can see here is that the blue line was the budgeted revenue, the red line, the actual. And the revenue shortfalls from overestimating revenues averaged 5.5% nearly every year since 2007. You go to the next page. Not only that, not only were the revenues being over forecasted in the past, but we see here that actual revenues being the light blue column, were also considerably lower than budgeted expenses. So expenses outweighed substantially the actual revenues. We were running deficits for a decade or more. The gap there is filled by one-time transfers, incremental debt proceeds, additional debt borrowings. And deferral, in addition, it was managed by deferring critical expenses like the required pension contributions, which are another outcome of this deficit situation. Next page. And finally, the recurring over budgeting of expenses generated significant structural deficits that led Puerto Rico into this severe financial crisis, which through the board's efforts is no longer the case. Next page. Now I'd like to turn for a moment to show and exhibit how we've stopped the practice of over forecasting revenues, which led to overspending and structural deficits. Despite the uncertainty caused by hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemics, the Oversight Board has underestimated revenue by 1.2% on average. And it's critical to understand this context because we often hear criticism that the board's revenue forecasts have been too low. In fact, this is exactly what we need to be doing. We need to stop the over forecasting of revenues because it causes overspending and structural deficits. So I'm going to spend one more minute on this topic. Since the formation of the Oversight Board, Puerto Rico has faced uncertainty, volatility that no state has had to deal with on such a regular and constant basis. And this has made revenue forecasting a challenge, there's no question. But as shown in this chart, despite the uncertainty and the volatility, the Oversight Board has only underestimated revenue by 1.2% on average when using the most relevant fiscal plan for each year. The one set of forecasts where the board does appear to have been conservative was in the April and June 2018 fiscal plans. These fiscal plans were prepared in an environment of high uncertainty following 2 devastating hurricanes, which resulted in a mass exodus of people, and before we had any clarity about the amount or pace of federal disaster funding that the island would receive. We had no idea at that time what stimulus effect or what stimulus would be received on the island that would affect revenues. And due to the uncertainty, the board made a very concerted and strong effort to prevent overspending in light of the situation. When it became clear what the federal stimulus would be, we immediately corrected the forecast once additional information became available. Again, it's important to underline, the revenues were significantly increased as a result of that exact federal funding, which played that important stimulus role in the economy. Without those funds, which were uncertain when we made the initial projections, the original estimates would have proven more telling. With the volatility subsiding and more clear information on federal recovery funds, more recent fiscal plans were not materially different from any actual results. In general, however, the public should know that the fiscal plans are living documents. As time passes and as new information becomes available, they will be updated. They will also be updated to reflect and incorporate new priorities of the governor and government at the time. If you turn to the next page, I need to bring it to the current situation because there's been a lot of discussion at transition meetings and other with regard to the first quarter or year-to-date forecast to actual. Year-to-date collections are 17% above the revised Hacienda forecasts, mainly explained by outperformance in motor vehicles, other general fund revenue, and rum cover-over. This slide shows the revenue performance fiscal year-to-date relative to Hacienda's expectations. It generally shows certain categories of revenue are performing better than initially forecast. The board, though, just to be clear, does not do monthly or quarterly revenue forecasts. The board sets annual revenue forecasts that the government then uses to translate into its own monthly forecast. We do monitor Hacienda's estimates on a monthly basis. And the outperformance that you see here is generally speaking consistent with what we're seeing in other states. Given the macroeconomic trends of the previous months, however, we still do not expect revenues to sustain this level of outperformance that you've seen in the first quarter throughout the year, as long as there continues to be an absence of incremental federal fiscal stimulus. It's also important to note that while collections appear better, these revenues haven't translated into an economy rebounding. Next page, please. We have to change the feed. The stream is down. So everyone, I've been asked to stop for 20 seconds. Just hold for a moment, please. We're having a technical problem. You let me know when we're ready. Okay, we're resuming. I apologize for the technical problems. On this page, what I'd like to show you is that state revenue forecasts tend to be conservative, and they underestimate actual revenues for the exact reasons that we have been doing so at the Oversight Board. We wanted to evaluate, by looking at the results of the different states, how our evaluation of revenues compares, whether the board's average forecast error of 1.2% in the year prior to the revenues is in line with other states or not. And as you can see on the map, 24 states have revenue forecasts that are slightly below actuals, and at least 32 states engage in revenue forecasting during the course of a fiscal year because of the volatility and the changes. The forecasts show that actual collections tend to be 2.1% higher than forecast, implying the board's revenue estimates are generally as accurate or more accurate than other states. Just as important, partial year assessment of revenue forecast accuracy can be misleading. Revenue may exceed a mid-year target as the monthly forecast distribution is not accurate, while the forecast for the year may be accurate. Next page. Moving on to the last element that I introduced to you of the four, economic development. And while there is definitely more work to be done on economic development, and frankly speaking, there can never be enough economic development, the board has already achieved several accomplishments in this area that promote economic growth. This includes the promotion of structural reforms that are critical to generating a competitive environment and attracting investment. One such reform was the board's facilitation of PREPA's entry into the LUMA agreement, setting the framework for transformation of Puerto Rico's electricity grid into a modern and efficient system. It also includes significant progress reforming the government's procurement system, which I mentioned earlier, improving road infrastructure and permitting systems, as well as pressing for the passage and implementation of an earned income tax credit, which should have a critically beneficial impact on labor participation rates on the island. The board's efforts to prioritize and attract investment through the Title V process, the approval of P3s, and through the development of strategies to attract manufacturing, in particular the return of pharma and medical device manufacturing to the island, also continue. And I'm going to conclude by highlighting the government also has an incredibly important economic development tool available to it through the buildings and land owned by PRIDCO. If you turn to the final page, just a quick reminder of how important this economic development tool is to Puerto Rico's future. Next page. Yeah, there you go. These buildings are one of the key elements that can be used to attract manufacturing back to Puerto Rico, a goal that we all share. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think you're on mute, David.
Thanks, Mr. Peterson. I saw the mute go on, and I forgot.
I have a few questions based on the presentation.
Go ahead.
Right? Is that good?
Absolutely.
So thank you for that, Natalie. The first thing I want to say is that I think we all agree that before PROMESA was passed, Puerto Rico had challenges, and I think we all agree that it still has challenges. I just want to ask some questions about some of the points you made in your presentation. I want to zero in on a couple areas as it relates to performance and how the board is arriving at its projections in the fiscal plan. So I just want to point out that when it comes to federal Medicaid reimbursement, currently the board is projecting 0 in fiscal year 2022. And I mean, I just think that that's contrary to all available historical data. In fact, Congress has been very consistent in plussing up Puerto Rico on the Medicaid front. And I know that you've got to make assumptions, and it would be, I'm not saying it would be responsible to assume a full match going forward for the next 10 years. But it seems equally imprudent to assume 0 going forward. I think even if you assumed a conservative estimate of 50–55% reimbursement, which again, looking at more recent performance, that's pretty conservative. That would yield $2.5 billion in additional revenue over the next 3 fiscal years. And so, you know, I've got a couple more questions, but just I'd like to discuss Medicaid for a minute because, you know, when we're talking about deals and getting deals done, I know the conversation always reverts back to structural reform, what's available to pay debt service. But in fact, I think that what we can all agree on, the data doesn't lie. And I want to ask a little bit about this year because already the Commonwealth has outperformed the fiscal plan by a lot this year. And I'll get to that in a minute. But if the Commonwealth is consistently outperforming the fiscal plan, and shouldn't we be looking at some of these larger items like Medicaid? And I would also welcome the thoughts of our advisors at Ernst & Young and McKinsey, who we pay a lot of money to. Actually, the taxpayers of Puerto Rico pay a lot of money to chime in on the Medicaid question. Because again, these guys are drawing up reports showing that population will decrease on an annual basis forever. So I guess that means going to zero at some point. And I don't know how you do that, and you have Medicaid costs going up. At some point, I think those lines should cross. So what's the reaction though on Medicaid? Let's talk about that for a minute if we can, and then I got another question or two.
Sure, let me start with the Medicaid question. So the board's principle of reflecting Medicaid is to reflect what the legislation in
I can't hear. You're on mute, Natalie.
My apologies.
Okay.
Thank you for the questions. The board's policy has been consistent to reflect whatever is legislated in fact for Medicaid, and it's updated annually to reflect any changes in the legislation. The board's projection for fiscal year 22 cannot be zero because the legislation reflects, and it reflects legislation, a 55-45 FMAP sharing with a cap of about $400 million. So the federal portion of Medicaid reflected going forward, unless there's any change in federal medication, reflects the current baseline legislation that exists, which is a cap of about 400. It might be between 390 and 400. I don't recall the exact number, but it's about 400. Medicaid policy for Puerto Rico has been adopted on a short-term basis, 1 year, 2 years at a time, with little to no confidence that those numbers can be replicated or repeated. And yet almost 60% of the population depends on Medicaid. And so the government of Puerto Rico has to be prepared to spend the money to pay for Medicaid because it has no choice, regardless of what Congress decides to do on a 1 or 2 year basis. In the absence of a long-term, fair, and equitable policy on Medicaid, which Puerto Rico unfortunately does not have in place right now, both the government and the board have worked on the Hill to try and achieve that ability to have predictable, long-term, fair, equitable Medicaid towards Puerto Rico. If legislation were indeed passed, again, the fiscal plan is a living document, it would reflect that. But in the interim, it is not a fiscal policy where you would assume you're getting federal funds that you don't actually know. You have no number that you could pick other than what is in the law, which is the cap. I have corrected, it's 390, not 400. So again, whenever the federal government comes in with incremental funds, which they have at different levels, 1 year 600, 1 year 249, 1 year, we have always reflected that, and we add that to federal funds. Important to note though, that adding federal revenues doesn't necessarily mean that it changes your surplus, because federal revenues cannot be used to fund debt.
No, I get that, but they're going into the overall budget, which, the revenue forecast, which is used to generate the fiscal plan.
We don't use federal funds to generate the revenues available for debt sustainability.
I know
we only use
talking past each other. I'm not saying the federal funds are used for debt sustainability, but I've read the budgets and the fiscal plan, and I see line items for federal funds talking about the whole budget. So, we're talking about a budget that is used for a number of things. And I'm not suggesting the federal funds are going to debt service, but I am suggesting that it makes no sense to me to expect zero above the territorial threshold of 390 when that's not been the case. And to me, my point is, it is equally imprudent, in my opinion, to underestimate and to assume zero above that cap, just as it would be imprudent for us to assume a new baseline of like what they've been doing the past several years. So that's one thought. The other thing I wanted to say is on the finances is, this year, I think I have this right, it's 700 and some million that the Commonwealth has already outperformed its the projections in the fiscal plan, $770 million. And so at what point are we going to acknowledge that and look at those as available resources for doing a deal with the Commonwealth creditors, who, as you know, constitutionally are entitled to all available resources of the Commonwealth in a recovery. So are we going to acknowledge those funds, number one? And number two, and I would like to bring our advisors in from McKinsey and Ernst & Young on this. When you guys are doing budgets for other clients, other corporate clients, a business, do you ever have scenarios where you just completely ignore present case scenarios when planning for the future? So in other words, I'd love to hear from McKinsey and Ernst & Young. You don't have to name your client, but give me an example of where, you know, you routinely are planning budgets for a client where you do not take into consideration any of the present term performance when forecasting for the future. And so I'd like to hear from our advisors. We're paying them tens of millions of dollars, and frankly, to publish information that is forecasting doom and gloom and is consistently wrong. So I would love to hear what they have to say about it. Thank you.
I'll pass it to my colleagues in just a moment. However, again, I'm going to go back to the slides. Being under by 1.2% is not consistently wrong. It's consistently how states budget on a regular basis. And that is what the map showed you as well, which is that it's consistently on average 2.1% under forecast. Under forecasting for a government that is—
Would you say 700 million by September? I think that's more than 1%.
I'll get to that in a moment. It's
okay.
Next slide. I'm just doing it one at a time here. Go to the year-to-date slide, please. As I showed you, the year-to-date revenues are indeed over by $329 million, July through September. October is not reflected here because October has not been published by Hacienda and is not yet public. That said, there is no way to derive that increase in revenues is annualized. It would be wrong for us to look at an economy that's been flush with federal stimulus, especially when you see where the source of that revenue increase is. For example, in motor vehicles, where you've had a delayed purchasing pattern of motor vehicles during the lockdown, and now with the stimulus checks, an increase in one-time purchases of motor vehicles. The issue on being wrong and not reflecting it being corrected, we correct it each and every time. So again, you go back to the previous slide, and you see that when new information comes in, the fiscal plans are updated to reflect that. Last year, FY20, you see the difference. The difference was $120 million by the end of the year. In fact, the fiscal plan had overestimated revenue in the two previous fiscal plans and had to correct that. It is not as simple as saying that we consistently under forecast, because we don't consistently under forecast. And the difference in the forecasting for a government that has historically overspent is not a good thing. But more importantly, the ability to hold the spending level down to the forecast level of revenues means that the cash is accumulated in the TSA.
Right,
so
a lot of it
has enabled the cash to be part of the debt deal, and the $6 billion that's generated is generated and includes any of that under forecasting. Now I'm going to turn it over and ask whether E&Y or McKinsey would like to make a comment.
Yeah, Natalie, this is Adam. I'll just add just two observations to what you shared. And thank you for the question, Justin, as well. I know our colleagues at McKinsey are the ones that are primarily responsible for the revenue forecast, along with our economists and other statisticians. However, when the forecasts are prepared, it is an annual forecast. The monthly breakdown is prepared by Hacienda to track sort of as they go through the year. And so that's not, while the board monitors those numbers obviously very closely, the expectation is that the fiscal plan is a multi-year forecast. It's not a month-by-month forecast. And as new information comes in, there's a regular sort of, iterative process to understand what's happening with the revenues and the likelihood that they may persist or not. And the current expectation is that for this fiscal year, that outperformance that you've seen for the first few months will not persist through the end of the year. And so, there's an active dialogue that I know does take place.
What's behind that assumption, given that there's been outperformance every year? number one. And number two, going to what Natalie said, I'd like to hear your answer to this, Adam. We make adjustments in the fiscal plan when there is outperformance. Why is it that every instance of that happening results in lower creditor recoveries?
Well, in terms of the forecast changing over time, I mean, there's outperformance and there's also underperformance on certain revenue streams as well. So, it cuts both ways, and you have to make judgments, and the board has to make judgments ultimately on what it feels is the most appropriate, forecast based on the best assumptions it can make. In
Adam,
terms of,
may I add something, Adam?
of course.
Justin, I think, Mr. Peterson, I think one of the issues is that each
You can call
of
me
the,
Justin.
Justin, each of the successive offers to the creditors have reflected both incremental short-term cash available as a result of that overperformance, but also, because it's 20-year debt, the declining ability to have more hard debt because of the affordability and the sustainability of the longer-term projections. The longer-term projections are showing that, unfortunately, structural reforms have been delayed or eliminated, and that has caused a portion to go away. Federal investment of the reconstruction funds has been delayed. I'm not placing blame on anyone's shoulders. It's just been a much slower process than anyone originally thought it would be, and pushed out over a longer period of time. So that stimulus is much more pushed out over time. And then finally, you're correct that with the Medicaid, and this is something you brought up earlier, Medicaid costs continue to grow at a pace faster than inflation, despite the population decrease. Population decrease is not reflected in a decrease in the Medicaid population, which are two different things. The fact is that Medicaid cost is rising rapidly. So the combination of lower growth because of lower structural reforms, delayed structural reforms, delayed investment of the federal reconstruction funds, and it being pulled out over a longer period of time makes the longer term projections unfortunately worse after each of the events that this island has been through: hurricanes, earthquakes, and now the pandemic. Puerto Rico's economy and its economic projections post-COVID are not the same as they were pre-COVID. That doesn't mean, and again, that doesn't mean that the overperformance that you see on this chart in fiscal year 20, right, fiscal year 2020, is still less than what we projected it would be before COVID, which was in 18 or 19. They have underperformed what our projection was before COVID hit. So they came out $100 million higher than our latest projection, yes, but they're still almost $1 billion off of what the projection was in the fiscal plan at the end of 2018. So comparing post-COVID to pre-COVID, that is what you're seeing that makes debt less sustainable or less affordable, less feasible. It's that change that happened from the 2018 fiscal plan to now. Even though they outperformed the last fiscal plan by 100, they underperformed the pre-COVID expectations by almost $1 billion.
Okay, well, I don't want to bog us down. Just two quick items. Again, I just want to point out that despite claims of making adjustments for overperformance, there always seems to be less money for creditors, and I think that's something I want to point out. So, question to Natalie and to Adam, because you're a former Treasury guy, you should know a lot about this. Going to Natalie's beginning of her presentation, talking about the progress, and as it relates to debt restructuring, I would put that in quotes, air quotes, the progress the board has made on restructuring. Other than people within this enterprise, have either of you spoken to anybody, any stakeholder who thinks that the board's progress at restructuring has been successful? And I specifically want to know what you hear from the large municipal debt insurers who provide the lubrication for public financing in this country. And because I've heard from them, and I think that they're very concerned that this board, literally, this board in this situation is upending long-held assumptions that the municipal debt market relies upon. So I'd like to hear both, really you, Adam, you're the Treasury guy. You know, what do you hear from the insurers on the progress that you all have made on debt restructuring?
So Adam, I'll start. You
Yeah,
can
no.
continue. Justin, those same insurers that have an opinion were a part of the consensual deal at COFINA. So I would say that they're pleased with the outcome of the consensual deal.
That's not what I hear from them, but keep going.
They were part of a 95% consensual deal at COFINA. The fact that we are not done with the restructuring is an issue, and we'd all like to be done. We were prepared to be done when we filed the plan of adjustment, a modified plan of adjustment in February of this year. Yes, if you ask me, are there people who are pleased with the results? I think there are many people who are pleased with the results.
Outside of this billion-dollar enterprise, the board.
Absolutely. The board's not a billion-dollar enterprise. We can go into that.
Sorry, 800 million, my bad.
800 million is not the spending of the board. The board has not spent $800 million. The GDB makes municipalities very grateful because in some sense, the municipalities got to retain and balance off their deposits against their liabilities in this transaction. The Commonwealth is happy. Mr. Marrero can comment on the fact that GDB is no longer, it is a what's the word I'm looking for? Non-recourse deal to the government and to the Commonwealth. I think if you speak to the Port Authority on the PREFA deal, they're pleased that they are able to enter into a P3 agreement and it isn't being held up because this deal has been completed. On PRASA, I think you'll see that everyone is pleased, including the federal government that participated in that reprofiling and provided the extra $400 million. On the next page, if you move to what is on file, again, in PREPA, many of the insurers are a part of that consensual RSA that was put on file. And I think that their disappointment is solely in the fact that we were unable to get the Puerto Rican legislature to legislate what was needed at the time to make this deal possible. So I think that there are many stakeholders that are pleased with the work that has been done to date. And there are many stakeholders and all stakeholders, including this board, that want much more to be completed and done.
Yes, Steve, do you want to elaborate at all or Willie on your interactions with the creditor groups and the monolines and others?
This is Steve Zell. I'll take it. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So, there has been, as you recall, Justin, a mediation that took place during the course of 2019 that did lead to a consensual deal with not all stakeholders, but with many stakeholders, about 10 to $11 billion of stakeholders. The monolines, as you point out, were not part of that consensual deal. Other stakeholders were, the monolines were not. But the whole goal, and then since obviously the COVID crisis, the board has had to rethink the forecast, the debate that was just had. And that rethinking of the forecast gave rise to continuing negotiations around a revised or modified plan of arrangement that we're still having hope to continue to have discussions. As to the monolines, we respect them very, very much. We do want them to be part of the process. They've had expectations to date that have been different from kind of where the economics based upon the fiscal plan of what was affordable for the Commonwealth. And to date, those demands or expectations have not been able to converge or reconcile with what the board has thought was affordable based upon the fiscal plans. It's also, I think, important to note that the monolines have different levels of claims. They have both general obligation claims, but they also have other obligations, clawback claims, and
yeah. And by the way, everybody has
different priorities and have different rights. And I think there's been a lot of work done to kind of find and make sure, as part of any process, that what claims do get paid are actually claims that are owed by the Commonwealth. So we're paying that which we can pay, both from an affordability standpoint and from a legal obligation standpoint. So it is difficult. We know they're not happy. It's not our intention. We'd love to bring as many people into the deal as possible, but that is not always possible. We had the deal back in February, but of course, COVID got in the way of the economics, and that's what we're trying to rethink.
Mm-hmm. So Adam, do you think that Puerto Rico's restructuring, Adam, has any precedent-setting potential or something we should be focused on from precedent setting for the municipal debt markets, the public finance markets? Would you say that the way this is going is being watched by the entities that are really essential to the lubrication of public finance markets?
I would say, and our colleague from Citigroup are on the line too, who are in the municipal bond market every day, and they probably have a view on this as well. But from my perspective, I would say that there's been fairly limited spillover impact into the broader municipal bond market. Access to the markets is at all-time highs. You see municipal issuers across the country able to access on a free and regular basis, the capital markets to fund their infrastructure and operating needs. Moreover, if you look at the municipal liquidity facility, which was set up by the Federal Reserve to backstop the municipal market more recently, there hasn't really been too much interest in drawing on that facility, and it's primarily because of that good, credit-worthy and liquid market that municipal issuers are still able to access, irrespective of what's been happening with this restructuring. I think the real story here is, what Natalie laid out in terms of, persistent structural deficits, spending beyond, what the government could afford to spend, and using that, the credit markets to be able to fund that gap for a prolonged period of time. So, this happened over decades, and so it's going to take time to, to work through it. Obviously, everybody wants this process to finish as fast and as quickly as possible, and with as little pain to everyone as possible, and particularly the people and the residents that live on the island and have to deal with the consequences of paying taxes and for services into the future. And so, from my perspective, I think the real story here is the board, trying to set up a process to have a sustainable level of debt, but also for all creditors and stakeholders to this process, the pensioners who, after 20 years, once the debt under the current proposal is mostly paid off, still has a considerable burden that needs to be paid off. So I haven't seen any. If your question is, have I seen spillover into the broader municipal market? I personally have not seen much spillover, but I think our colleagues at Citi might have a perspective, and they're closer to the markets.
Well, that was not my question. My question is, and we don't have to keep. I mean, I appreciate your answer, and I don't want to prolong this part of the program any further. But just to be clear, my question was whether or not what happens here has any effect or consequence on the municipal markets, whether we see spillover effect yet or not.
Justin, maybe.
But I'm not trying to take over the meeting. You guys have answered a lot of my questions. If anybody else has something to say, I don't want to prevent that from happening. I just want to say for the record that I agree with something you said, Adam, that the people who really matter here are the people of Puerto Rico. In my view, they've spent $1 billion almost of their money on a project that has not yielded much. And I would like that may not be the view of others, and that's okay. We don't all have to agree. That's just my view. I would like that in the record, in the minutes, that that's my view. And I am committed to expediting this process and doing whatever I can to facilitate that. And I'm glad to hear that others are committed to that. So
thank you, Justin. And for the record, I think I'll yield back. Thank you. For the record, I just want to go through the fees so that it's clear in the record. The $800 million.
Natalie, can we hold on just a second? I think Anna had a question she wanted to ask before we change topic, or a comment she wants to make.
Natalie, I just wanted to get back to the point that I think you made, but I just want to make sure that we made it more clearly. I think that if I heard you correctly, you said that, to the extent that revenues have come in over projections, and to the extent that in places where spending or other elements come in and additional funds become available, what's happened with that is that it's increased available cash, and that available cash is then in turn taken into consideration the plan of adjustment. Just want to make sure that I heard that correctly.
That's correct. Remember that I mentioned that the TSA was down to $15 million at one point. Today, the TSA is over $9 billion as a result of the board limiting the amount of expenditures as compared to revenues, and any incremental revenues that were not budgeted, any overperformance falls into that TSA and has made it possible to make the $6 billion cash consideration available.
So to the extent that there's been deviation in what happens, which I agree with you that projections are projections. If we had the benefit of actuals, that'd be awesome, but we'd have to wait 3 years to be able to fund anything, given what happens in planet reality. I wanted to make sure that, I wanted to make sure that I'm clear, because it seems to me what's happened is, to the extent that there's been deviations, the effect of it has been that we have reduced services and reduced spending and required cuts that perhaps were not 100% necessary based on what has, or the pace was not 100% necessary based on actual performance of revenues.
That would be accurate in the sense that we allowed spending at a forecast level and not at the overperformance level. So we required cuts to live within a certain spending limitation. Yes. And
just making sure that I remember correctly, the level of cuts that have been imposed or that are being phased in over the course of the fiscal plan to just general government services is about at least a quarter, closer to 30% in terms of the bucket that is called as right sizing. And the level of reductions that is being required of healthcare spending is somewhere north of 20%, if I recall. Am I generally in the ballpark on those?
I don't have the exact numbers, but generally that's correct. We've required that the Medicaid curve be broken such that there are value-based reforms and they reduce that curve that I described earlier, faster than inflation growth on Medicaid, excuse me, and the right sizing is on average, I think, about 30% total from 17 through the end of 23, fiscal year 17 and 23.
Got it.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I just want to, again, for the record, talk about the fees so that the numbers are clear. Justin, you mentioned $800 million in fees. That is, in fact, the number of total fees in the Title III cases for all Title III entities and for all spenders. The board's portion of that is less than 50%, $393 million. So less than 50% of the 800 in the Title III court has been spent by the Oversight Board.
Right, but it all gets billed to the people of Puerto Rico. That's my point.
No question.
And you've got opportunists like the UCC filing frivolous litigation, spending tens of millions of dollars. That's what I mean about this whole process.
92 million, in fact, UCC.
Right.
But go back to the debt deals. However, when we talk about what the value of the total 800, which is not the board's spending, less than half of which is the board. The government is one of the set of expenditures. The UCC is one. The Committee of Retirees is one. The mediation team is one, and the COFINA agents are included in that. When we think about even if you take the full 800 million that the people of Puerto Rico had unfortunately have to pay, the people of Puerto Rico have received back already more than a $17 billion reduction in debt service at COFINA, a 45% reduction of approximately $2 billion at GDB, the smaller reduction that you see at PRIFA, the incremental monies at PRASA, which far outweigh just that portion. But there's other things that are a result of those fees that I think the people of Puerto Rico have benefited from and are very important. At the beginning of this Title III process, claims were made. Actually, 173,000 claims were made, totaling $43.5 trillion, not billion, not million, trillion dollars of claims. Without the work of some of the advisors and the legal team, those trillions of dollars of claims against the Commonwealth might have had to be paid, even if it was paid on a discounted basis. But the work of the advisors to reduce that and to reduce and eliminate thousands of claims in this process has been extraordinarily valuable. The number is down to under 42 billion at this point. We've eliminated $41 trillion of claims in the work that's been done. Those are claims that might have had to be paid by the Commonwealth, by the people of Puerto Rico. But it's not only that. In the sense we've saved money, billions of dollars, at ERS with the lawsuits and the litigation that has been successful in limiting and defining the actual claim at ERS. I would say that the board saved the Commonwealth about $7.5 billion with regard to ERS, and that would have had to come out of pension contributions. There are numerous places to show that the people of Puerto Rico, no question, have had to pay that $800 million in Title III expenses, and we wish they did not have to. But the savings and the work that's been done by the group of people, both in the board, the government, to enable the results that I'm showing you on this page alone, not to mention others, is multiples of that $800 million.
I think Adam may have another question or comment.
Natalie, can you remind me where things were on the pension front, or Adam, when Puerto Rico came in, when the board came in? And because I think as we step back, I think one of the important things to remember is, kind of where Puerto Rico would be in the absence of Title III. And it seems to me, if I recall correctly, we were in a position where pension funds were out of dollars. And so when we talk about kind of what have been the benefits, there's clearly the benefits associated with restructuring, but remind me, but my recollection is in the absence of the work that's been done, pensioners would not have necessary resources to be able to, to pay their bills. Similarly, the government's ability to be able to fund critical services like healthcare, like education, would have been severely impacted. So when we think about kind of, benefits, I think we need to look at the totality and what Title III, both on the challenge side, which is the cuts that have been required and have been imposed, as well as what's been possible to pay. So it'd be helpful to kind of walk through the initial cash situation of some of these overall benefits and where Puerto Rico would have been in trying to pay for benefits in the absence of things like pay-go and other changes that have been made.
I'll try, and then maybe someone else can help add to the answer, maybe a little more substantive in terms of numbers. The pension, the ERS, the Employee Retirement Service, the largest of the civil service pension funds, was funded at a level of 1% to 2% when the board was created. So it had the ability to pay no pensions after about a year. If the move hadn't been made to pay-go, to add that $2.3 billion of government expense, 2.6 total billion dollars of pay-go to the budget and have the government pay current pensions today, there was no ability of the pension funds to fund pensions going forward. TRS and JRS were slightly more funded. The level of funding was slightly higher, but not enough to fund pensions in the medium term. I think that answers some of the questions. I'm not sure, Adam or Gaurav, do you want to add? Anybody want to add to anything?
Yeah, Gaurav, I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Sure. I mean, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
There were, Anna, to your point, there was just shy of approximately 150,000 retirees and beneficiaries that would be subject to risk in the context of the pension funding running out. So that was sort of the risk that, and what kind of compounding impact they have, of course, in basic survival, but more importantly as well, at the same time, the economic impact that would have transcended into Puerto Rico, given the fact that majority of the population is on island, would have had a compounding impact. So Title III at least did allow for ensuring that some of those existing funds that were otherwise subject to risk were continuing to be made in terms of the pension payments.
It's helpful. I mean, I as I step back and I reflect on this, and I think that, David, Andrew, and I have been at it for way longer than we anticipated. But as we step back and we think through, there are a lot of things about it that I wish that, we had known where things were going and we could have done differently. And I look forward to opportunities to, as we think about future revisions to the fiscal plan and future changes to the budgets, that in an environment where the cash position is very different than where we started, that we step back and we look at what are we doing to be able to support to support opportunity and to support the turnaround of Puerto Rico and to support the opportunity for folks to be able to have some of the as I think back of kind of both my experience in public service, and so much of what I have is based on growing up in Puerto Rico and the opportunities that I had, and the values that have been instilled in me based on family and my experiences. And I think, as we talked about it the last time, I think about a fiscal plan focused on, and I think of it as a little girl. But in some ways, the outcomes are far worse for the little boy that doesn't learn how to read by 3rd grade. I think that that's who we need to keep in mind as we think about future changes to the fiscal plan. And I'm concerned around what has been required of the government of Puerto Rico and what the challenges that people have been implementing, and the lost purchasing power by folks that are working really hard to deliver government services. And I worry about continued reductions in healthcare and the challenges in access that are required by that have been required by the current situation when we look at the rates of diabetes and heart disease and the transplants and amputations and other challenges that are disproportionately related there when we think about it in the context of the poverty rates that we see in Puerto Rico. So I think that we really have to think about and I'm sure the new administration is going to be thinking about many of these questions in terms of what is the need to invest and where do we go. But when we step back and we think about our time here, if the board had not chosen to go into Title III, I'm not sure how the 150,000 pensioners or so would have been able to pay to eat. So when I think about benefits of Title III, we can talk about financial restructurings and percentages of savings of the debt and where should we be, and as I think I appreciate Justin how clearly you made it in the first opportunity that we had to talk about the fact that you saw that our job was to revise the fiscal plan to make more dollars available for debt service, and I understand that perspective. But I think if we step back and we look at what we've done, and in the absence of a Title III vote, I'm not sure how services would have gotten paid at all. And I'm not sure what that would have done to the economy and where we would have been. And so I kind of come back to what is our fundamental obligation. And we are in a process, right? Like bankruptcy it can be very complicated or it can be very, very simple. And I think of it as very simple. And in the very simple way, it's basically a process establishing law to say, uncle, step back, restructure, deleverage, and figure out how we move forward, because the current train was headed in a bad direction. And in that process, there's a lot of really difficult things and a lot of folks that came in with a particular perspective and things turn in a different perspective. And I think about all the people that, invested their savings into Puerto Rican bonds and then traded out of those bonds and sustained huge losses in their retirements. And, I feel for them, just like I feel for all the people that have been suffering for a really long period of time, just like I feel for the little boy and the little girl who's lost a year of school. And what are we going to do to make sure that they have the necessary services, that they have the necessary assistance to be able to deal with their learning gap so that they have an opportunity to have a life that is, at least a fraction of as lucky and as privileged as I've been in the opportunities that I've had to have more.
I just want to say, Anna, I really appreciate and respect your passion and your expertise and all the work you put in. You clearly all the work you put into this, and I've got great respect for that. And I think you're right. This is about the people in Puerto Rico. As you speak of the little boy or the little girl, I agree with that. And I don't think anybody here today has been relitigating, no pun intended, the decision on whether or not to go to Title III. That's in the past. I'm raising questions about how we are counting resources, how we are accounting for resources, how we're making projections, and how we're approaching the objective of what PROMESA says in the statute, which is to settle with creditors in the bankruptcy and just end this process. And I think that it would be a huge mistake not to be focused on the people that you're focused on. And that's why I have so much respect for you. I believe that the way we can be responsive is to focus on growth. And I'm not saying nobody else here is focused on growth, but I am. I'm very optimistic about the new governor. I think he's focused on growth. I think he's a leader. Over I can to support him and his administration in that regard. And as it relates to pensioners and people being able to eat, absolutely, the process has worked for them. But who it has not worked for are a lot of retirees who depend on bonds that they bought, retirees on Puerto Rico and on the mainland. And I don't put a value on anybody's life that one person is more important than another. I think this process has to work for everybody. And again, I appreciate being able to work with you, and I respect where you're coming from.
David, can I make a quick comment?
Absolutely.
Sure. I know we want to get through this, but I think this has actually been a very, very helpful kind of conversation to have. Just in the sense that it just raises these various issues, various claims we kind of hear from the outside. My thoughts are just fairly limited to some small kind of almost technical things, but I think one thing that made the Puerto Rico bankruptcy different than what you saw, say, in Detroit or Stockton or other places was it wasn't simply the governmental entity that was insolvent, it was the pension systems that were insolvent as well. And say in Detroit, you didn't have that. It was underfunded. It was not anywhere near where ERS was and is in Puerto Rico. And I think that complicates the situation. Forcing the pension plans, or the pension plans being forced to go to PAYGO, that increased costs the government. Sometimes you'll hear the board being criticized for allowing governmental spending to rise, all from the same sources that are hitting us on the tax estimates or whatever. But a lot of that is just the pension PAYGO cost. If you didn't pay that, then essentially, as Anna said, you'd simply be cutting people off. And the board has argued for progressive reductions to pension benefits. We've also recognized that if you were to have a precipitous cut in pension benefits for low-income retirees in the island, that's a really, really big humanitarian problem. I think Justin raised an important point on how we think about Medicaid funding going on. Obviously, you cannot use Medicaid funding to pay debt, but it is the effect on overall government finances. And this is not something I think the board has talked about this quite a bit in past meetings, that it's so we're not been kind of blithe about it. I will say that in my background in federal government is the Social Security Administration or Bush White House working on Social Security, which we know is underfunded. The baseline assumption of the Social Security Administration is when the trust fund runs out, benefits get cut. Even though I personally think that is politically unlikely. If I voice that view, I get an earful from the chief actuary at Social Security and say they said that's what the assumption is. You can't assume money you don't have. I think when we think about Medicaid, I completely get that it's just what is written in the law is not what we've been seeing in recent years. At the same time, though, I'd be reluctant to commit to a fixed or a certain payment of debt going out 20 years based on a contingent and uncertain level of Medicaid funding. It's just in financial markets, you would price that debt payment down quite a bit because the money coming up from it is so highly uncertain, or you'd make the debt payment contingent. So, I think, Justin's raising a legitimately difficult issue of how we think about this stuff. But I think the point is that it's not like the board has sort of, tried to just ignore it, but it's just a legitimately very, very hard thing to do, because you're not just thinking about, making some lump sum debt payment today. You're saying, what are we going to be paying over 10 years or 20 years based on Medicaid funding that we just don't really know what it is. And so it's just a hard thing, but I'm glad we are wrestling with these things that, people who are watching this are getting a feeling for the sorts of discussions we've been having internally over the past 4 years. And it's just a hard thing to figure out. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew, for that, because I think I agree. These are really challenging issues, and I think there are lots of different really important ways to think it through. And I think what your comments kind of brought to me is in some way it kind of crystallizes, as you often do, the point. And I think part of the challenge in all of this is, of course, everyone is for growth. Of course, everyone is for more Medicaid funding. Well, not everyone, or it would be current law, but of course we think it makes a lot of sense. I think that the question, I think, and where it all comes down to is partly a question of risk and risk tolerance, and who bears the burden if things and the assumptions do not materialize. And I think that's kind of fundamentally what it comes down to, right? Is baking in growth and having it not happen, and having that lead to more devastating cuts and more degradation of services or a future restructuring. Right, that's I think part of what we struggle with, is really not wanting to have that be what happens, and having whatever occurs be something that we think is sustainable, and that we think, at least for me, that I think is sustainable, that I think is defensible, and that I think we can actually stand by and afford, and not be in a place where folks are retraded, or where even more devastating and degradation of fundamentals is required and imposed on the people of Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Ana. Any other comments or questions from the board on Natalie's presentation? I'll just say for myself, I think this discussion has been really helpful, and helpful, I think, both for us and for people who are watching. Two very small points by way of conclusion to go back to where we started, which was the revenue forecast. It strikes me that the revenue forecasts have been remarkably accurate. They've been very, very close in unbelievably uncertain times. So I think that speaks well for the staff and advisors of the board. And the other comment I'll make is, where there are disagreements about those revenue forecasts and our expectations for greater government efficiency, and there are disagreements. There are people on the left think that we're way too optimistic about Puerto Rico's economy going forward. People on the right think we're way too pessimistic about Puerto Rico's economy going forward. One of the really nice things about the plan that we discussed, the plan of adjustment we discussed at the last meeting, and we'll be discussing in a few minutes, hopefully, is that it has a contingent debt instrument, what's called a contingent value instrument, that is designed to pay more to creditors if it turns out that the Puerto Rico economy does better than projected, which I think is a great way to try to bridge some of those gaps. With that, Natalie, thanks so much for this presentation, which is very helpful. Why don't we move on to our next agenda item, which is a section 204B, reapportionments and reprogramming. And again, this is Natalie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll move very quickly. I want to present for the Oversight Board's action a series of recommendations on reapportionment requests from the government of Puerto Rico and several public corporations. They're attached here too as Exhibit 1. I'd like to note, can you move? I'd like to note that this list, go to the next page, includes a series of reapportionment requests that reflect the desire of the government to reapportion funds to make a possible reapportion savings in certain categories of the budget that would enable the government and HTA and PREPA and the University of Puerto Rico to pay for Christmas bonuses from the savings in other parts of the budget. Those are all recommended for approval here at the bottom of the page. Are there any questions?
Questions from the board? All in favor, please say yes. Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? The resolution passes then. Yeah, actually, I think we should back up. I think we should actually propose the resolution before we pass it. So let's try again. Does somebody want to, will somebody propose the motion?
Sure, I'll move to approve the recommendations on the requested reapportionments.
And will anybody second?
Second.
Thank you, Andrew and Justin. So let's try this again. All in favor, say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Any opposed? No opposition. The motion therefore passes. The next item that we have is a contract review discussion under Section 204B. Pursuant to Section 204B of PROMESA, which allows the Oversight Board to require prior Oversight Board approval of certain contracts and to ensure such proposed contracts promote market competition and are not inconsistent with the approved fiscal plan. Pursuant to this power under Section 204B, we have 3 contracts for consideration. The first is a contract between PREPA and PUMA for diesel fuel. And Alejandro Figueroa, Infrastructure Director, hopefully is here and hopefully will walk us through the contract elements and the recommendations that the staff has for the Oversight Board. Are you here, Alejandro?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to the board members. We have for your consideration today a proposed 1-year extension to the existing contract between the PUMA, Energy Caribe and PREPA for the supply of diesel used for the generation of electricity. The total value of the proposed contract is approximately $225 million, of which $132 million are projected to be spent during the current fiscal year. There are no changes to the terms and conditions of the existing contract or agreement. That includes the pricing structure, which ranges from $9 to $10 per barrel, depending on the volume of diesel delivered. The proposed contract also includes an additional 1-year automatic extension under which if no party communicates their intention to extend the agreement at least 120 days prior to the expiration date, the contract is then extended for an additional 1 year. Under the agreement, Puma would supply all of PREPA's diesel burning units, including San Juan 5 and 6, and those located at Palo Seco, Aguirre, Mayagüez, Cambalache, and the peaking units spread throughout the island. Accordingly, we recommend the board approve the proposed contract submitted by PREPA as consistent with the certified fiscal plan and certified budget in order to ensure a steady supply of diesel to PREPA. Going forward, we also request the board to reiterate the importance of PREPA to proactively explore opportunities to improve competitive fuel procurement and delivery practices as required by the certified fiscal plan. To that extent, the board staff will look to work closely with PREPA staff to improve PREPA's standing in the market, attract high quality suppliers, and benefit from increased competition and better fuel prices.
Chairman, based on the foregoing, we recommend the board consider the following resolution. Resolved, the board authorizes the proposed contract between PREPA and Puma Energy Caribe LLC for the supply of diesel fuel to PREPA's generation plants, as such proposed contract was submitted by PREPA to the Oversight Board pursuant to Section 204(b)(2) of PROMESA. The board further reiterates the importance of PREPA improving its fuel procurement practices and directs the board staff to work collaboratively with PREPA to achieve the fuel procurement improvements and the objectives in PREPA's certified fiscal plan.
Are there any questions from or comments from board members on this contract? Okay, will somebody make a motion to approve it?
Sure, I move to approve the contract.
Thank you, Andrew. Will somebody second it?
Second.
Thank you, Justin. Let me take a voice vote. All in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? No opposition. Therefore, this motion passes as well. The second contract that we have in this segment before us is a settlement agreement for an outstanding loan between PRASA and the Government Development Bank. And I believe that James Castiglione from Citi will be telling us about this contract and what it entails and what it is that we're being asked to approve. James, are you there?
Yes, hi, good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, the rest of the board members as well. Can we go to the slide for the PRASA GDB Debt Recovery Authority? So through the GDB Title VI restructuring that was done in 2018, a portion of PRASA's obligations to the GDB were transferred over to the GDB Debt Recovery Authority, otherwise known as the DRA. This loan was approximately $78 million, and recently on November 10th, 2020, FOMB and PRASA and the DRA reached an agreement in principle to settle this obligation for $20.5 million, which represents a $57.5 million reduction, or 74% of the outstanding obligation. Next slide, please. This payment will be made from PRASA's cash on hand, given that it is a one-time payment to resolve the balance. Currently, PRASA has in their current expense fund approximately $186 million. The settlement is in compliance with the fiscal plan because it provides, in addition to the haircut or discount to the outstanding claim, it removes associated litigation risk. It facilitates PRASA's ability to access the capital markets and provides a path for the proposed refunding by removing any unnecessary noise of the DRA, as well as cleans up PRASA's balance sheet. With that said, it is the recommendation of the FOMB team to approve this. At this time, I'll take any questions.
Are there any questions from the board? Okay, so can we have a motion to approve the contract?
I so move.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Justin. Counting on the two of you. So we have a motion and a second. I will again ask for a voice vote. Will all in favor say yes? Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Everyone who voted has voted in favor, and therefore this contract is approved. We also have another contract, which I think is our last contract to discuss, and it's an MCO contract. And my understanding is that Janorli Maldonado is going to discuss it. Janorli?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Skeel. We have for the board's consideration and review the final managed care organizations contract amendment, which includes the proposed increase in the Puerto Rico poverty line, the PRPL, as well as the required renegotiated rates. This past October, the oversight met with the governor and members of her staff in New York City to discuss the government's proposal of a temporary expansion of the Puerto Rico poverty line that could potentially benefit 200,000 additional lives into the Medicaid healthcare plan. After that meeting, the Oversight Board communicated to the government its approval, conditioned to the implementation of certain requirements, given the government inability to commit the new government to taking action. The requirements were the following. First, to ensure that the expansion is temporary by using a time-bound state plan amendment, waiver, or other appropriate mechanism. Second, a detailed expenditure projections and identification of Commonwealth share of funds within their existing fiscal year 2021 budget. The amendment of the MCO contract with language to signal the increased eligibility is to be temporary. And lastly, a development of a public communications campaign to provide information about the change in temporary eligibility. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the latest contract amendment has two major items for consideration. First and most important, the Puerto Rico poverty line increase, it's not certain to be temporary. Even though the MCO contract amendment does include language approved by CMS, addressing the temporary eligibility for the emergency medical group until September 30th, 2021, the state plan amendment as submitted to CMS is not time-bound, as previously required by the board and agreed by the government. The board agreed to a temporary expansion due to the expiration of federal funding in September 2021. The government has stated intent to use a regular SPA, which is not time-bound, after CMS recommendation. This change would be indefinite until another SPA reverses the expansion. Thus, future administration would have to actively remove the Puerto Rico poverty line. Second, the government submitted an amended PMPM, which is higher, $8.40 above the target implied in the certified fiscal plan. Back in August, the board agreed to a higher PMPM of $7, subject to the government identifying the funds within its budget and the inclusion of language into the MCO contract that would promote value-based reforms and reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. Revised sectoral projections reflect an incremental $1.60 PMPM, translating to $20 million annually, and that is potentially due to the PRPL expansion. The government projects it can cover these expenditures by using projected savings associated to the shifting of the Commonwealth population into the Medicaid population. So as a permanent increase, if you go to the next slide, a permanent increase could cost as much as 300 and 600 million per year for the government, which would lead to expenditures above those in the certified fiscal plan under a federal Medicaid assistance percentage scenario of 55-45. As such, the recommendation made to the Oversight Board today is to approve the contract with the increased PMPM of $1.60 due to the PRPL expansion, subject to the condition of the government resubmitting to CMS a time-bound state plan amendment to be in compliance with the requirements which were previously established by the board and agreed by the government. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will pause now and see if there are any questions.
Generally, can you say again what the condition on the proposal is?
Yes, so the condition is that the government resubmits a state plan amendment with CMS to make it time bound, that the expansion of the Puerto Rico poverty line is set to expire on September 30th, 2021, which is the date the additional federal funds will cease.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from the board? Okay, so we have a recommendation that we approve a resolution that would approve this contract conditionally, as Janorli has just described it. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Andrew. Do I have a second?
A second.
Thank you, Ada. Take a voice vote. All in favor, say yes.
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 Opposed? All the members have voted in favor of the resolution, and so the resolution is approved. We can move on to our next agenda item, which is a Section 207 debt issue involving PRASA. And it's actually two transactions under Section 207 of PROMESA. And once again, James Castiglione of Citi, I believe, is going to give us an overview of these two debt transactions.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and good morning again. Can you go to the next slide, please? PRASA has hired Barclays to lead a syndicate to execute a potential refunding of certain outstanding PRASA bonds, subject to market conditions at the time of issuance. Given the lack of updated disclosure among other items, PRASA is moving forward with a limited public offering to no more than 35 accredited investors with the refunding bonds. Additionally, and subject to market conditions, the refunding bonds are expected to amortize in a similar manner as the bonds being refunded, and there will be no maturity extension. Additionally, there will be no front loading of savings, and savings will be generally level throughout the existing maturity profile. PRASA plans to use those annual savings to supplement their capital improvement program or to close financial gaps included in the PRASA fiscal plan. Importantly, the refunding PB savings must meet a threshold of 5% and 10% respectively for the senior and subordinate liens. Subject to market conditions, the refunding bonds will be fixed rate debt with a 10-year par call and will be issued without ratings, and the refunding bonds will be sold without a debt service reserve fund. It is anticipated that PRASA will bring this transaction to the market as soon as possible in conjunction with their underwriter. Lastly, this issue will be sold purely for refunding, and there will be no new money proceeds. And as Mr. Chair discussed, there's also the resolution of the GDB DRA loan, which I discussed previously, which is a settlement of a PRASA obligation for $20.5 million, which represents a 74% reduction in obligation. At this time, I'm happy to take any questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, James. Are there any questions? I have a procedural question, which is, I think, for Jaime El Khoury, and that is, do we vote on these two together, or should we vote on them separately?
You can vote together. The resolution can be for both.
Okay, so kind of a combined of these two pieces of the puzzle. Do I have a motion from the board to approve the proposed refunding?
So moved.
Thank you, Andrew. Second?
Second.
Thank you, Justin. All in favor, say yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? The motion passes. The next question, or the next topic that we have is again under 207, the debt approval part of PROMESA, and it is a municipal debt obligation, and I believe that Herman Ojeda will be walking us through this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today I bring to you a proposal by the municipality of Gurabo under Section 207 of PROMESA, requesting the modification in use of remaining proceeds from bonds originally issued during fiscal year 2013. The proposed transaction, very important, does not involve the issuance of new debt. The total amount of the bond's original issuance back in FY 2013 was of $12,523,475, and the current proposed transaction is for $541,773. The purpose of the modification in use of these remaining funds is road resurfacing needed due to damage caused by Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Our analysis demonstrates that the municipality, based on historical and forecasted special tax collections, will have sufficient repayment capacity. And as a result, we propose that the transaction be approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ojeda. Are there any questions on this proposal from the board? Can I have a motion for approval then?
So moved.
Thank you, Andrew. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Justin. We'll have a vote again. All in favor, say yes. Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? This motion is approved as well. Thank you, Mr. Ojeda. The next topic on our agenda is Act 80, 81, and 82. And I'm not sure who is going to discuss this. Is this Natalie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, and I'll try and go through this relatively quickly. The board has had an ongoing dialogue with the government of Puerto Rico with regard to Acts 80, 81, and 82 as they were enacted late in June of this year. And we've performed detailed analysis on all three acts because PROMESA requires that any newly enacted law be not significantly inconsistent with the fiscal plan. Maintaining cost neutrality is paramount to achieving the surpluses required in the fiscal plans, the annual budgets, and for enabling the debt service that we talked about earlier today. The public has asked us many times over to explain our position, and I want to take this opportunity to walk through it. I know I won't be able to answer everyone's questions, but I'll try to answer at least some of them. Next slide. After evaluating all of the three acts, Act 80 and 81 and 82, from the perspective of the board, are likely to have an incremental cost to the government. And let me explain what each law does and why it potentially would be very costly for the government. I'll start with Law 80, Act 80. The law provides an early retirement window for certain employees of ERS, all ERS or Employee Retirement Service employers. And it means that certain employees in all agencies of the central government, but also those at the municipalities and several public corporations, such as HTA, PRASA, COSEC, AELA, Ponce Muele, would be eligible to retire under this act. And there are three primary reasons why the board believes there will be an incremental cost to this law. First, the fiscal plan already includes the savings of a 3,200 person headcount reduction in fiscal year 23. So the savings from the reduction of 3,200 people over the next year is already included in the fiscal plan. And the government cannot double count that savings. Second, the act offers additional benefits, which I'll explain further in a few minutes. And finally, several employers have already indicated that they will not be able to reduce positions by the amounts inferred by the government, further reiterating that there's likely to be a cost from this act. Analysis has not been performed by the government to support feasibility of the high level of headcount reduction required to offset the counts. Similarly, Act 81 provides enhanced retirement benefits to police, firefighters, paramedics, and correctional officers that participate in Act 447 and Act 1. Act 82 is slightly different. In fact, the government's certification incorrectly asserts that there would be no cost to this act. Act 82 amends Law 26 of 2017 to authorize the use of sick leave towards teacher retirement eligibility and pension benefits. The incremental cost is primarily driven by the ability to buy up to a certain number of additional years of service and the associated pension benefits derived from the additional service credits. Turn to the next slide. And if we look at the board's key concerns with these acts, despite repeated efforts, we have not been able to come to agreement with the government, and we have not received sufficient support for the Oversight Board to conclude that the laws are consistent with the certified fiscal plan. And the unanswered concerns are several, many of which have been explained in different letters, and I know there have been a lot of documentation. The government has responded to many of the concerns from their perspective. But just to start, number one, these laws are potentially very expensive, costing up to $8.3 billion in incremental costs that are not taken into effect, not forecast in the fiscal plan. Second, as I showed you on the previous slide, you can't double count the payroll savings that's already in the fiscal plan of the first 3,200 people that have already been reduced in the fiscal plan by the end of fiscal year 23. Third, there's no insured savings in the laws. There's a lot of discussion of insuring savings, but there is no law, there's nothing in the laws that ensures the savings. If positions need to be refilled and are deemed essential, there's not even any payroll savings from those positions. Fourth, Act 80, in essence, actually unfreezes a frozen pension system. And this is important to note because it was the government that froze the benefits offered under the system in 2013, prior to PROMESA, because they recognized that the benefits as delivered under the defined benefit plan then were no longer affordable. And yet now here we are enhancing those benefits. The actions also have implications on the plan of adjustment assumptions and the process that must be used in the courts. Next, it imposes a significant cost burden on employers, including municipalities and public corporations, who must foot the bill for larger benefits if they're not able to permanently reduce headcount. Sixth, it could jeopardize the ability to access certain federal funds at certain agencies. And finally, the whole approach to these laws is repeating the mistakes of the past that led to the bankruptcy of the pension systems in the first place, adding benefits that aren't affordable. Go to the next slide. So I'm just quickly going to say, this has been a long, I'm sure Mr. Moreno will agree, and it involved back and forth collaborative dialogue and discussion with the government of Puerto Rico. There has not been any lack of attempts to try and reach an understanding of how this law could be fiscally neutral. Every effort has been made. Next page. This is this is the calculation of the board that lays out where the costs, when we talk about what the incremental costs of the acts are, where it would come from. In aggregate, the cost could be as large as $8.3 billion over the next 30 years. And the way to pay for the enhanced benefits is not clear. What we've said is if the enhanced benefits are paid through incremental reductions in personnel, show us the incremental personnel reductions, where they occur, and how the savings will be achieved. But there is no plan to actually, no plan has been shared as of today to actually show how to pay for these enhanced benefits. Next slide. This is just to give you a sense of how personnel savings have already been included in the fiscal plan, and for which the government can't take double credit. What you see on this page, in the top graph, it's in dollars, in the bottom, in average implied headcount based on average salaries. And what this shows is where personnel spending was in FY17 before the board, where personnel spending is today in FY21, and what the assumptions are through FY22 and 23 in the fiscal plan. Headcount reductions are already in the fiscal plan. So to the extent that these laws enable it, that's fine, but the payroll savings is already in the fiscal plan for the first 3,200 employees. And the increased benefits for those 3,200 employees is not included. Go to the next page. I think we'll just move forward for the sake of time. I think we move forward. This just basically goes back again to the point that I made earlier, that this is the pattern that led in many ways contributed to the bankruptcy and insolvency of the pension funds, repeatedly increasing benefits without having adequate funding. There were ad hoc increases from time to time. There were increased additional minimum pension benefits. Christmas bonuses on the pensions were provided, medication bonuses, summer bonuses, COLAs. It's not whether or not the policy is valuable or not valuable, it's how you're going to pay for it is the question. And we don't have an answer as to how we would be able to pay for it. I think the next page, next slide. I'm trying to save time here. I'll just take you through one law and one calculation so you understand that how the calculation occurs. Next page. We've heard from some both government officials, legislative officials, that they don't understand how we came up with any incremental cost. And so I wanted to show an illustrative, simplified calculation that would demonstrate the source of these costs. The benefit enhancements for Act 80 are projected to cost up to $4.2 billion nominally through fiscal year 2049. And the cost is not surprising. It has three primary drivers. First, participants are being encouraged to retire earlier, and as a result, they receive their benefits for a longer period of time. They're retired for longer, their retirement benefits add up to more money. If you look at the first column, this represents eligible employees covered under Act 447. And if you assume that these employees would have worked until age 65, then we have 7,180 employees who on average would receive 6 years of additional payments before they were expected to retire, absent Act 80. Given that Act 80 pays 50% of pay, that's just over $17,000 per year and approximately $740 million in those 6 years alone. So the first element is the cost that's due to actually encouraging earlier retirement, people being on retirement earlier and longer than was calculated and assumed in the fiscal plan. Second, Act 80 increases the retirement benefits payable for life, well beyond the retirement promise in the current law. So looking back at that first column, this increases payments by $4,725 per year for the lifetime of these employees. If an employee is expected to live for 24 years from today, then this produces a $610 million cost over the 18 years the employee was expected to be retired. These increased payments total $1.7 billion across all eligible employees. Third, Act 80 pays $100 a month until participants turn 62. This adds $100 million more in cost. And the government has yet to conclusively demonstrate that this $4.2 billion benefit can be paid for. We'll post on our website the next page on the calculations on Act 81 and 82, but I will skip through going through them for the sake of time. I was prepared to bring today a motion to the board with regard to authorizing next steps. However, today I received this morning before the meeting a letter from the government of Puerto Rico from a FOF, which I'd like to read to you, if that's all right with Mr. Marrero. And as a result of this letter, Omar, I'm sorry.
No,
okay.
Please go ahead, Natalie. No objection from my end.
Dear Mr. Esco, as you know, the Retirement Acts pursue social justice policies targeted at vulnerable and important components of the public employment sector. To date, the government of Puerto Rico has responded to multiple oversight board requests for information and has provided thousands of documents to support the government's conclusion that these acts represent billions of dollars in savings. As you know, the government has even provided actuarial studies to the oversight board, which explain the savings provided for in the Retirement Acts. It is important to note these acts do not represent pension benefit increases, since the benefits will be paid out of the payroll line item budget of the different agencies, corporations, and municipalities. In light of the most recent actions and public comments by the Oversight Board, which threaten public employees that make use of the benefits of the Retirement Acts, We hereby confirm the government of Puerto Rico will continue to identify the interested employees that wish to make use of the benefits of the Retirement Acts as described in my previous correspondence regarding this matter. However, to ensure public employees' rights and to provide certainty to the ongoing processes in the debt negotiation front, the government will not implement the Retirement Acts until an agreement is reached with the Oversight Board concerning these important public policy acts. As always, the government of Puerto Rico is committed to collaborating with the Oversight Board to reach consensus on these matters for the benefit of the people of Puerto Rico. Respectfully, Omar Marrero Diaz, Executive Director. So, although we could debate different lines and sentences of the letter with regard to the first paragraph, the second paragraph is the commitment of the government to work with us, to collaborate with us, to find an agreement or reach agreement on the consistency of these acts before they are implemented. In other words, the government will not implement the Retirement Acts until an agreement is reached with the Oversight Board concerning these acts. In light of that letter, my recommendation from my perspective to the board is that we accept this letter for what it states, that there will be no implementation until we reach agreement, and therefore no further action at this time need to be taken by the board. However, the staff will have to work closely, the staff and advisors will have to work closely with the government to continue to identify how these incremental costs, whether they be in the pension line or the payroll line, can be made consistent with the fiscal plan. Any questions?
Thank you, Natalie. Omar, would you like to say anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, as I stated in the letter, even though this acts they were aimed in allowing those employees that are at that stage that not necessarily they are in the most productive stage of their life, particularly after what we have faced during the last couple of years. Again, we were inspired by that social justice in allowing those people to be to retire in an early fashion, and we believe that we could make it happen within the four corners of the budget and without putting additional pressure. However, as I stated in the letter, and based on the concerns that many employees have, and particularly because the decision to retire brings so many other decisions, and it's so important for the employees, and because we don't want to put them in a position of in a more vulnerable position, or even in a position that it is determined that they couldn't retire, or the benefits will be taken away, and without the option in returning to the public government. Again, I think that it is in the best interest of the government of Puerto Rico, as well as it is in the best interest of the future pension holders, that we sit down and we ease any concerns that the Oversight Board may have. We reach an agreement, and more importantly, we identify what would be the universe that will be interested in availing itself of the benefits, and more importantly, delineating a plan of implementation to make sure that the essential services to the people of Puerto Rico are not affected. And in the case that any agency may be rendered unoperational because of this employees requesting retirement through this laws, we need to have obviously a plan to implement and to make sure that any unintended consequence is properly addressed. So again, as I clearly stated in the letter, we will not implement the laws, and we will issue a circular letter to the employees through the administrator of the employee retirement system to make sure that the employees understand our position. Again, we will continue to collaborate. We expect to be able to move forward from this. However, I think that we need to provide certainty to the people of Puerto Rico, particularly public employees, that may be tempted to take other decisions based on this retirement laws. And again, we just want to make sure that we properly address those concerns, and we are responsible in our duties with our people.
Thank you, Omar. Any other questions or comments from the board? Okay, we'll look forward to working on that together. The last item that we have before public comments is the Commonwealth Plan of Adjustment. This is section 303 of PROMESA, and it's a discussion and potential resolution that we discussed last board meeting. We're going to bring back up now about a possible plan of adjustment modification. And my understanding is that Willie Everett of PJT is going to walk us through that.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is William Everett, and I'm here with Steve Zelen, partner and head of PJT Partners Restructuring and Special Situations Group. As we talked about at the October 30th public board meeting, the board has evaluated the February plan of adjustment in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result of that review, the board re-entered formal mediation in August. The resulting proposals were publicly disclosed on September 30th. Since then, the board and its advisors have worked to develop an amended plan structure that reflects the results of the deepening economic crisis post-COVID. The outlines of the proposal are largely similar to the August 18th proposal, with the notable exception of an additional contingent value instrument, or CVI. The lower half of this page includes a comparison to the February plan. The consideration of both structures, to sort of be clear for everyone listening, assume an effective date of the Title III plan of July 1st, 2021. So in the right column, you'll see the terms of the revised proposal. The proposal includes $6 billion of cash, which is a slight increase from the February plan, approximately $5 billion of GO debt, which is approximately $4.4 billion lower than the February filed plan. And importantly, the debt structure makes two key adjustments. First, maximum annual debt service, inclusive of the restructured COFINA bonds, has been lowered to $1.05 billion, as compared to approximately $1.5 billion in the February plan. Second, the proposed adjusted plan does not have a secured bond component, but instead consists of 100% GO bonds. In addition, as discussed further on the following page, this proposal includes a CVI, which is limited to a lifetime payout of $1 billion. And importantly, this proposal would increase the threshold of pensions that remain unaffected from any cuts from $1,200 to $1,500 per month. Moving to the next page, I'll run through the key terms of the CVI. Given that the CVI is a new part of the proposal, we thought it'd be helpful to revisit some of these key features for the board to consider. The CVI is based on the 5.5% sales and use tax, the collections of which are reported consistent with the post-restructured COFINA bonds. The instrument provides reporting transparency to the market, given it's a structure and revenue source that the market already understands. And importantly, the CVI is structured such that it would only pay out in the event of outperformance of sales and use tax collections above the 2020 certified fiscal plan projections. The payment of this CVI, as you can see summarized in the table on the right, is limited by a lifetime cap of $1 billion and a yearly cap of $50 million. So of that outperformance, creditors would receive 40% of it. So in other words, if the 5.5% sales and use taxes were to increase by $100 relative to the prior plan, the CVI would pay out $40. Additionally, and importantly, the CVI would also be a general obligation of the Commonwealth. We've included a visualization, a graph at the bottom of the page. The red line indicates the attachment point of the instrument, which is where it begins paying out incremental payments. So if the collections exceed these projections, again, creditors would receive 40% of that outperformance up to the annual cap of $50 million. And the graph assumes 2% outperformance on an annual basis, though certainly at this point, that outperformance is unknown. So with that brief summary, happy to take any questions or give it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there questions from anybody on the board?
I I don't have a question. I just want to say that, you know, we discussed this revised plan of adjustment at the last meeting, and my opinions on it have not changed. I think that fundamentally the biggest problem I have with it is, despite the overperformance this year so far to the tune of 700 million, and a logical basis to presume that there's more money available for debt service, this revised plan of adjustment takes money from people who have never been paid, retired in Puerto Rico and on the mainland, and it gives money to people who have never been impaired. So I think it's inequitable. I think it probably will be received as such. But I think it's important that we get to mediation. So as long as we can structure the resolution, and I believe it is structured this way, that negotiation must precede any filing, then I'm for moving forward into mediation, and let's get at the table and see what people say. And I think mediation should be as inclusive as possible.
Thank you, Justin. Other questions or comments from the board?
My question is more around the resolution whenever we get to it. So
yeah, I was about to say, I will, when we're finished with questions and comments, I will read the resolution because lots of people won't remember it from a month ago or almost a month ago. And then I'll ask Jaime El-Khoury to describe it. But before we turn to that, are there any other questions or conversation or comments from the board? Okay, so why don't we turn to that? I'll read the resolution and then I'll ask Jaime to describe how he understands, and I think we all understand the resolution, what he understands it to mean, and then we'll take comments and questions on the resolution before voting on it, assuming we get a motion and a second. So here is the resolution. Resolved, the board authorizes the immediate commencement of negotiations with creditors and other parties under the current mediation agreement, consistent with the proposals contained in an exhibit to these materials, with a view to the filing of an amended plan of adjustment as soon as practically possible. So that's the resolution. Jaime, can you describe what it means to us before we talk about it?
Yes, thank you, David. So what this resolution does is that it recommends that the proposals by this meeting and by Willie Everts form the basis of an amended plan of adjustment. That be the basis, the pillars. We recommend, this resolution recommends that we engage, that the board engages with creditors to negotiate in a responsible manner and with good faith on the basis of these proposals. The resolution, of course, contemplates that if the negotiations produce changes to these proposals, as contained in the exhibit, we would have to come back to the board to seek your approval with respect to those changes. Also contemplated is that if the negotiations fail for whatever reason, then the board is authorizing to proceed with the filing of an amended plan of adjustment that incorporates the proposals as you have them in front of you. And just to be clear, what the resolution doesn't do is it is not recommending that we file an amended plan of adjustment based on these proposals today, but that there be, as a precondition, negotiations with the creditors before the filing of an amended plan of adjustment.
Thank you, Jaime. Are there questions or comments from the board on the resolution?
if I can, David, I have a question. I just want to make sure it's crystal clear. So I think we've all been all good with the negotiations up front, but I want to be crystal clear. Does the executive director under this resolution have the authority post those negotiations to submit a plan of adjustment that is consistent with these terms, if that is a determination after the negotiations without a subsequent board vote? And is a subsequent board vote necessary if in the product of negotiations, things land at a different place?
Should I answer, Mr. Chair?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jaime.
Yes, that is the sense of the resolution. As I said, if a precondition is negotiate the recommencement, so to speak, of the negotiations with the creditors on the basis of these proposals, there could be two paths that then occur. One is that as a result of these negotiations, we have to come back to you, to the board, to seek any changes to the proposals. So you will have a second bite at the apple. Or if the determination is after good faith and responsible negotiations take place, that those negotiations have, quote unquote, failed, then yes, you are authorizing today the filing of an amended plan of adjustment based on the proposals presented today.
Thank you.
And sorry, just to make sure it's crystal clear. And so the parameters for the negotiation that would be authorized is these parameters. Movement from these parameters would have to come back to the board, to the vote.
That is correct.
I have one other question.
Sure.
The negotiations, Jaime, what in your view defines that means, but I want to know what you think it means. And second, I presume that we as board members can be, I plan to be involved in the negotiations to make sure that we're not to say anything negative about the board's advisors. I think they do a lot of good work, but I plan to be involved to make sure that we're giving them direction as it relates to opportunity. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, I didn't catch the first point you made, but I'll start with the second and then you can tell me about the first. Yes, the experience that we have had in negotiations without, of course, revealing any mediation confidentiality issues here. The experience we have had is that board members are actively involved. The mediation team led by Judge Hauser is one that actually promotes that kind of interaction at a certain point. I mean, it is, of course, the dynamics of negotiations, and PJT can opine on this or give more comments, but the dynamics of negotiations are such that it's fruitful and productive first to start with the advisors, but the mediation team led by Judge Hauser, in my experience, will consider and bring in the principles, so to speak, at certain points. So yes, you broke up a little bit on the first point, but
David, can you hear me? I apologize. Something's going on where I lost most of my feed, and I just need to restart it. Can I do that real quick?
Sure. Yeah, you broke up.
Don't worry, I'm not leaving.
You broke
okay.
I'll be right back. Okay. Oh wait, I figured it out. I'm sorry. I'm back. Are you guys there? Can you hear me?
We can hear you clearly now.
Okay. I'd like to make a a motion to modify the resolution as follows: that if negotiations fail, that the board has another ability to say something about filing the plan. I'd like to offer that modification.
I'll just say, I'll let other people speak, but I've come into this meeting with the view I will not vote in favor of any modifications, but they certainly can be in any direction. But I'm just stating that from my own opinion. I apologize. I was meaning to send an email before this meeting to say that privately before I say it publicly. But a motion to adjust certainly can be entertained.
Given what the issues we had at the last meeting, I would prefer not to amend the resolution.
So what's the practical? I honestly am just trying to. I'm not trying to hold anything up here. I just want to make sure I'm being a good steward of my position. So Jaime, what is the practical? What's the practical ability that I, as a board member, have to help define and determine whether or not negotiations have been in good faith? Does that make sense? My question. In other words, we could have a couple of meetings and the advisors could say, well, we tried, and the creditors could have a different view. And according to the way this resolution's written, we just file the plan of adjustment. So what's my ability?
I think
shape the opinion of what's in good faith.
I'll let others speak, but in my experience, Justin, as I said before, the mediation team led by Judge Hauser, you will get a front seat. You will get a front seat view of the negotiations. It will be, I think, pretty, I will say, pretty easy. It will be recognizable by you, as well as the other board members.
Meaning I would have the ability to help shape the decision on whether or not they're being in good faith, and therefore they should be over.
Yeah, that is correct.
David, is that your view as well?
My understanding is that it will take a board vote to do to shift direction. So you certainly, each one of us has the power to be involved in the negotiations as actively as we in the mediators think is appropriate, but we can't unilaterally decide where that goes. So that would require a board vote. One other comment about participating in the negotiations, I would plan to do that as well. It complicates things when principals participate in negotiations. It means that the principals of the other parties will need to be there, and it may have some confidentiality implications. We can ask our advisors about that, but we certainly have participated in the mediation in the past, and I very much with you, we can maybe take the train together, plan to participate as well.
Okay. Yeah, I would want to, because I feel like, again, from an outside looking in perspective, that the creditors, the stakeholders, would have a different view of good faith sometimes than the board has. And I'm not saying that directly at anybody. So I just want to make sure that I can help ensure that that's happening. And by the way, I want to do whatever I can to make sure that the Commonwealth is included as well, and the new governor, because I think he's key to this. Look, I think he's going to be a great governor, and I think that we need to involve him in order for this to be successful. So I'm supportive of the original resolution. I'll withdraw my motion for a modification, given what I've learned from Jaime and David. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Justin. And if we can, I'd like to move to a vote, because I think we may maybe about to lose Anna to California. Do I have a motion to approve the resolution, or to propose the resolution?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor, say yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Say no. The resolution passes, and I'll just make the comment that I think this is a very good thing. I think it's important to move forward in the Title III process. The sooner Puerto Rico gets out of Title III, I think the better everybody is. So I feel good that we're taking an important step forward today. The next issue that we have is public comments, and I think that'll be Natalie as well.
It will be a variety of us. The comments came in for a variety of people in the meeting today, and there are a lot of them. I may at some point read out a question and then just say that we've covered it already, because it's quite a bit. We'll start from the top. The first question from Dan N. Bigman Montalvo. The question: recently, Mr. Esco made some expressions regarding the usage of Pritco buildings. Could you please expand on these comments? Will the board promote the use and sale of these underused assets? If so, will Pritco regulations change to reflect this fact? Will Pritco be allowed to accept offers for buildings that are in considerable disrepair or underutilized? So yes, not to belabor this too long, but Pritco's portfolio represents one of the most valuable tools of the economic development package that the government of Puerto Rico uses to attract investment onto the island. The inventory, however, has been run down as a result of poor management, lack of capital planning. The economic development efforts in the search for reshoring of pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers relies substantially on the availability of these brownfield facilities as turnkey properties for reshoring those businesses. And to the extent which they are ready and marketable, it often defines whether a company chooses Puerto Rico or chooses elsewhere. Currently, Pritco does not have any readily available properties. Most would require an influx of capital investments in order to be considered marketable. And so the Pritco fiscal plan frames what is the beginning of a road towards sustainability and effective property management. The board, through the fiscal plan, promotes the use and sale of these underused assets. The board promotes through the fiscal plan the responsible use of the properties. And if it's better for the organization to demolish a building than to repair and rebuild it, then so be it. The budget that the board certified, for example, included the demolition of 55 properties that apparently have been judged not salvageable. In addition, section 6.6 of the fiscal plan states the divestment of non-rentable properties. Based on current information, Pritco has approximately 30% of the units in vacancy or non-rentable status. And this additional revenue that could be generated is extremely important if proper investment and management could be applied. Next set of questions from Ting Ting Fang. What is the time frame for the approval process of the shovel-ready solar energy projects? Will FOMB be flexible on the 150 megawatt limit for the initial approval? The board required PREPA to apply objective and transparent criteria to select the best qualified developers within that 150 megawatt limit, just like you would do in any competitive procurement process. Remember that these non-operational PPOAs were not procured in a competitive process 10 years, whenever, 20 years ago when they were entered into. In terms of timing, it's up to PREPA to conclude the process. We have not received any word that they have concluded the process of reviewing and submitted to us the 150 megawatts. The 150 megawatt limit is flexible to the extent that it fits within the fiscal plan. So if the negotiated price per kilowatt hour is lower than what was in the fiscal plan, more could be done. But as long as the negotiated price is higher than in the fiscal plan and results in a higher cost to consumers, it has to be within the 150 megawatt limit. The next set of questions from Victor Gonzalez of Winmar. Section 204B2 requires that the FOMB ensure proposed contracts promote market competition. Do the market prices determined by the PREPA board, the so-called board determined market prices, promote market competition? How can you ensure that contracts promote market competition when you allow the market price to be determined by the PREPA board? How is accepting board-determined market prices not a violation of PROMESA 204B? You also have fiscal plan determined market prices for energy. Does having predetermined prices promote market competition? Mr. Gonzalez, the board reads the concept of promoting market competition objective in PROMESA as referring to the procurement process, a transparent procurement competitive process for procurement, including PPOAs. Further, even in a competitive process, PREPA can set the price target it believes is reasonable, and if a developer is unable to meet that target, PREPA is in no way obligated by PROMESA to accept a higher price proposal, particularly when there are other proposals that do comply with those price targets. Going forward, the board has been clear that PREPA must procure new generation resources competitively and transparently, not unlike the contract that we discussed and the efforts we discussed during the PREPA fuel contract earlier today. And they need to use competitive processes to achieve the best possible market price. A question from Pierre-Luc Vezina-Labelle. It would be nice for the island to have all green renewable energy up and running, not just the first 150 megawatts. The future is now for the island. Thank you. We support the development of renewables. We understand that as the energy policy of Puerto Rico adopted by the legislature and being executed by the government. It's reflected in the fiscal plan, but the development of renewables has to be at competitive prices, because if we don't achieve the lowest possible rates, then the consumers of Puerto Rico suffer. Todd Shongala. I am astonished that the FOMB director, Natalie Jaresco, thinks she knows more about renewable energy than PREPA and PREB. I was shocked when she unilaterally decided to reduce the first round of solar projects to 150 megawatts instead of the 450 megawatts approved by those two boards based on the recommendations of their own energy experts. The FOMB's unexpected move has created yet another roadblock in Puerto Rico's efforts to reach its near-term legislated targets for renewable energy. Need I remind the FOMB that their similar attempt to lower the price of oil actually resulted in a higher price being paid and higher electric bills for all. Puerto Rico's electric grid is still short on power and fragile. Let's get these first 450 megawatts built ASAP. They will strengthen the transmission lines they feed and may save lives in the event of another disaster. We can try for a slightly better price on the second 450 megawatts. Considering that the solar projects are approved by PREPA and PREB will provide clean power at half the price PREPA currently pays, why doesn't the FOMB immediately greenlight every shovel-ready solar project at today's meeting? Thank you, Mr. Shangala. It's a long question. I'll try. So again, I want to restate, the board is supportive of the government of Puerto Rico and the legislature of Puerto Rico's energy policy on renewables. We are not in any way trying to disturb the process of bringing renewables to the island. But the development of renewables has to be done at prices that achieve the lowest possible rate for customers. Just as an example, at times natural gas is much less expensive depending on different situations. Again, the issue for the board is not anti-renewable, and the decision of the board had nothing to do with being anti-renewable. The board is fully supportive of the energy policy of Puerto Rico. However, every incremental decision that incrementally raises the price of fuel, which the 450 megawatts as proposed by the PREPA board and PREB did, compared to the fiscal plan, means an ultimately higher cost to the consumers of electricity. PREPA's board stated during a public meeting recently that it was on track to achieve the 20% renewable target by 2022, which shows that our decision has not hindered the ability of the island to reach its renewable targets. But the path toward achieving the targets has to come with transparent competitive procurements, commitment to fulfill the fiscal plan, and we reiterate that launching a competitive process for renewals, for a lot more renewables, more than the 450, in a competitive way, would prove to all what the market prices could or could not be, and launching a process in a competitive fashion as soon as possible is the goal. Horacio Rivero asks, why can't the restructuring of the Commonwealth's debt consist solely of an exchange into a contingent value instrument with a maturity of 30 years or a cap up to approximately 80% of general obligation and PBA debt claims. Wouldn't this allow the Commonwealth to exit Title III with zero debt? So I won't speak for creditors, but it is rare, if ever, that a restructuring of this size has occurred with only a contingent value instrument. I don't think there has ever been a restructuring that has been concluded solely with the contingent value instrument without some type of hard debt or other compensations. I don't know whether my colleagues would agree, Steve or Willie, but I think it's highly unlikely. And I think the negotiations over the past few years have proven that solely a CVI would not be a way to achieve a consensual agreement. Somebody want to add something?
I would agree with that, but there also may be a legal requirement that Martin Bienenstock or Brian Rosen from Brusco might be able to supplement as well. I would agree with your comment now.
Okay, if there's no other comments, we'll move on to the next question. Miguel Roldan Ruiz. And this is more of a statement, I think, to the government. So, Mr. Marrero, the job of a first responder is to provide and to protect and preserve life, property, evidence, and the environment. And in some situations, these mandates are in conflict, resulting in the possibility of further distress. First responders sacrifice their lives to protect the lives of others, where many have contracted the deadly disease as a result of having contact with the public involving emotionally distressing situations. The Christmas bonus should be awarded to first responders, nurses, and doctors who worked in the front line and first line of defense against COVID. The Christmas bonus should not be awarded to those public employees who stayed in their homes during the pandemic. I request that my recommendation be accepted and the work of these heroes recognized. As earlier, you know, we approved the government's request for reapportionment for a Christmas bonus, which is for all employees. We have worked separately with the government, and I'm going to pass the baton to Mr. Marrero to provide frontline workers with incremental bonuses as a result of the very hard work that and commitment and sacrifice that you described. Those one-time bonuses were delivered earlier in this year when COVID first hit. Omar, do you want to add anything?
Sure, Natalie, thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the question. Well, I think that first of all, we need to remember that Christmas bonus is not a prize. It's not a freebie that we give public employees. It's the right that they have to this compensation. It's a way, it's a social justice instrument that it was legislated since the 1960s in response to the huge difference in salaries from the mainland to Puerto Rico. So again, more than a prize or a freebie, just free money being given away to public employees. Again, it's part of the compensation. It's a statutory compensation. They are obviously they have access and they have a right to it. So again, as for the first responder, I totally agree. That's why since March, before any other U.S. jurisdiction, we were collaborating with the Oversight Board, and we have to commend, obviously, the collaboration that we received from the Oversight Board, particularly its executive director, in making sure that not only we had an immediate relief package to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, but we also were able to provide hazard pay to the first responder, particularly that first line of doctors, nurses, as well as police, and many others have been working as part of the COVID-19. In addition to that, more recently, we were also supportive of a hazard pay that was paid to public nurses in some other hospitals that were also being exposed to the COVID-19 as permitted by the guidelines of the Treasury. So again, we have taken many actions in making sure that first line and first responders are acknowledged and their contribution is well acknowledged. But as to the Christmas bonus, again, it is a statutory compensation that employees in Puerto Rico have a right to.
Next question from Andrew Hennigan, Esquire. Were any federal funds, including any funds associated with or derived from Puerto Rico's drinking water or clean water state revolving funds, transferred to the Debt Recovery Authority as part of the GDB qualifying modification transaction? Second part of the question, in addition, What event triggered the Commonwealth's $188 million contingent long-term liability, quote, for the custodial credit risk loss on deposits held at GDB, unquote, identified in the Commonwealth CAFRs for fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 20. CCAFR 2016 and 200 gone. See the CAFR. So I know we're running out of time and I have pages and pages of questions. So I'll just do this quickly and then I will post answers to all the other questions we've received since we're about to lose our chairman afterwards. The answer to this question: Process successfully reprofiled its loans with federal agencies, EPA and USDA, which achieved $380 million in savings, and it's seeking to achieve additional savings through the refunding transaction today that was approved. And doing so makes it possible for PRASA to fund the transfer to the Debt Recovery Authority today without any use of any federal funds. Omar, do you want to add anything? It's being made from cash on hand, bottom line. In terms of the CAFR, I don't have the CAFRs in front of me, and I can't define. We'll get back to you on the second question because I don't have it. David, again, I've got pages and pages of questions. So if you'd like to bring this to an end, I will just have to post the questions online.
Thank you, Natalie. And sorry to have to run. We're having trouble keeping everybody, including me, on the call. So we have, as Natalie said, we do have, it sounds like lots more questions. We will answer all of the questions and post them online. So hopefully we can adjourn at this point. Thanks to everyone for what I think has been a very, very productive meeting and a very informative discussion of a number of key issues. So I would like to move that we adjourn the meeting. Do I have a second? Thank you, Justin. And I'll ask for a vote. All in favor, say yes.
Yes.
That was the most enthusiastic I've heard all morning. Again, thanks to all. I think we covered some really important business today. And we will no doubt have another meeting soon. As I've already said, we will answer the questions we were not able to get to on our website. But everyone having voted in favor of adjourning the meeting, the meeting is now adjourned, and there will be, I understand, a press conference afterwards as well. Thanks, everyone.